Hey, what's up, guys? Chad here with the Reptile Rangers. Now, we're at the Kernersville Reptile Zoo and Medical Center and Store again today, and we're going to talk about feeding schedules, or proper feeding for your reptile, more appropriately, snake. Now, just before we get into this, right there in that bottom corner, right where my finger's pointing, is our subscriber button. Make sure you hit that, and for all those that have, we appreciate your subscription and following along week after week, video after video. Now, let's get right into this. All right, guys. So there's been, of course, one of the groups that I'm an admin in, big Burmese python group, there's always conjecture and discussion about feeding. Appropriate foods, appropriate schedules, how often, is power feeding good, bad, don't power feed at all ever. Well, we're going to talk about some of this today. Now, there's, like I always say, there's a lot of rights, but there's also a lot of wrongs when it comes to feeding schedules and what to feed. Let's talk about this. Let's just get started with, first and foremost, each snake is different, okay? You need to know the snake that you're working with, its specific metabolism rates, what it does in the wild, how it reacts, its activity level. You need to know the snake itself, and you need to know kind of what its body does or does not do. Does it have a high propensity for obesity, or does it have a higher metabolism? Is it more of an active snake or a lazier snake? Does it climb a lot, or does it stay terrestrial, meaning on the ground quite a bit more? Because each one of these can make a difference. Now, when we also start talking about differences, one of the things that's going to make a big difference also is going to be what you feed. A lot of folks and a lot of your cheesy, just little crappy expos and your cheesy little box stores, you know, your trashy little box stores, want to just constantly push mice. There is nothing nutritional to mice. Nothing. They're a waste of money. But when we start talking about things like baby colubrids, kings, corns, milks, bull snakes, indigos, gophers, pines, a lot of your colubrid species, babies are smaller. Some of them are a little bit bigger and can take rat pinkies right out of the egg. But some of them are quite a bit smaller, and they have to take mouse pinkies. Okay, that's fine. They take mouse pinkies enough to give them enough of a growth rate to get them over to the rat pinkies where it's more nutritional. There are other things like quail. You can do guinea pigs. When the snakes are big enough, you can do small goats. You can do pigs. You can do rabbits. There are so many different options for feeders. African sulfurs is another one. African sulfurs is a great alternative to mice because the pinkies of the ASFs are near the same size as a mouse pinky, but the African sulfurs is still more of a rat, so it's a lot more nutritional. ASFs are harder to get, though. There's not as many people breeding them here of late. So it also depends on what you're feeding, okay? What type of feeder you're feeding as to how often you may have to feed. Every time we have a customer come in and they've got a decent-sized ball python, understand when you start freezing something, you start killing the natural enzymes in it. So what little nutrition it has when it's fresh alive or fresh killed, once you start freezing it, you start killing out some of that natural nutritional content. So there's even less than what there was when it was healthy. And for mice, there's not much to begin with. They're mostly tendons and bones. There's very little meat content to them and very little fatty content to them, okay? But when they buy these, and they have this, usually we see it from a 1.5 to 3 foot ball python, right? Or maybe even a boa. And they're like, man, this thing is just agitated all the time, or it acts like it's hungry all the time. First question is, what are you feeding it? Mice. Well, no effing wonder. It's not full. It's never going to be full eating trash food like mice. Stop wasting your money. Now, let's talk about some other aspects. And now, in this particular group, this Burmese python group, okay, like one of our Burms right here, this Burmese python, she takes anything from 15-pound rabbits, big, massive full show rabbits, baby pigs, baby goats, stuff like that. But she doesn't need to eat all that often, okay? So understand, when we start talking about size of food, you can also start talking about distances between feedings, because the bigger the meal, the longer the rate of absorption, and the longer it takes them to metabolize that, especially if they're a lazier snake, like a Burmese python, like a rock python. Snakes like reticulated pythons, even though a large constrictor, up until a certain footage, those animals are quite a bit more active. They're more of like a large constricting colubrid, okay? So they are a more active snake. Most people know this that have ever had a retic. They're constantly exploring and pushing at different edges and trying to find ways to escape or just being curious throughout their pen. So retics do tend to be a little bit more active, so their metabolism rate is a little bit faster than what like a berm or a boa or a rock python. Now let's talk about power feeding. So you have some people that's like power feeding is bad, don't power feed ever. And you have some people that's like, oh man, power feeding is awesome, we need to do that. We need to do that all the time. No, you don't want to do either, okay? One of the things, I'm not a proponent of constantly power feeding, but think about this. In the wild, if you truly want to mimic nature, they have times of plenty, they have times of lean. So there's going to be times where power feeding may be necessary for a short period, okay? Especially if you're trying to mimic nature. Now, one of the things, use for example, if you never breed an animal, if you're not into the breeding aspect and you just want to do a consistent feeding, okay, great. If you feed something every couple of weeks, a good, just appropriate size meal every couple of weeks, no harm, no foul, you're not going to have an obese animal, you're not going to have an unhealthy animal. It's just a constant, consistent feeding, no big deal. But again, know your animal and know what its body cannot do, what it will or will not do under certain feeding regimens. Use, for example, in some of our breeding animals, right? And our breeding animals, let's say the big Burmese right here, this is one of our breeding females. 6 weeks before she's going to be getting put into a breeding aspect or a possibility of a breeding aspect, we'll feed her a little bit more. That way she takes in nutrition, extra nutrition, to help fatten her up a little bit to when she does go off of feeding, because remember, when they're pregnant, they are developing the eggs, they will go off feeding most of the time. So while she's off feeding, she still has that nutritional content that helps her to still be able to produce healthy eggs, but at the same time, be able to survive and not get too terribly skinny once she lays those eggs. During the time that she's producing those eggs or developing those eggs, as it were, then she's going to go off of food. So there's your time of lean. So it's compensating for the time that you power fed. Okay, as soon as they lay the eggs, we do a power feeding regimen for about 6 to 8 weeks to help put size back to her, or at least good nutritional content and a little bit of muscle mass, a little bit of fatty content back to her. And then we go back for probably 3 or 4 or 5 months of maybe this girl eats once a month. Maybe she once every 6 weeks, depending on what meal she feeds on, okay? So it goes back to a more normal feeding, normal absorption rate. Now, things like colubrids, like your corn snakes, those animals can eat meat, and you hardly ever see them get obese unless they've been so overfed or put in an enclosure that's so small that they can't really move around enough. Animals like boa constrictors are awesome. Carpet pythons are awesome. Carpets usually stay skinnier. Boas can get thicker. And if boas are overfed, they will get very, very obese. Knowing the animal, knowing what they should look like, knowing what they shouldn't look like, knowing what they should eat, shouldn't eat. Now, there's things that they shouldn't be eating. Absolutely. There's some things that probably is just best to not feed those animals. For one, mice is just, it's a no-no. Just no. It's useless. Okay. If you have access to African saw furs, that's a better alternative to mice. If you don't, then, for certain species, maybe you do have to start off with mice. But anything over a colubrid can take a rat pinky, generally speaking. Anything over the size of a baby colubrid can take a rat pinky pretty much right out of the gate. You have certain species like your eyelash vipers and some of your arboreal tree vipers that when they're born, they are super small, and they do have to take, some of them have to take things just like a leg or a head or braining it or a tail because they're just so finicky. But in cases like that, those are more of your rare cases. It's not that pressing for a lot of your stuff that's more naturally kept, like things like your ball pythons and your corn snakes and your king snakes and your Burmese pythons, your boas, your carpets. A lot of these are just a standardly kept species, and what they take is perfectly fine. But again, the question comes down to what should you feed? How often should you feed? And the question answered to that is it depends on what you're feeding, depends on how often you should feed. This is Chad. We are here at the Kernersville Reptile Zoo Medical Center and Store. Hopefully this has been helpful, at least give you an idea. We're not trying to tell you when to feed, when not to feed, because that's going to be case by case, animal by animal, situation by situation based, right? If you're just keeping a pet, it doesn't need to feed as often. If you're keeping and you're breeding something, it may need to feed a little bit more often, close to breeding time or just after breeding time. If you have a small, high energy animal, it may need to feed more often. If you have a larger constrictor that is lazier, you may need to feed less often. Okay? So this is just giving you a idea of situational-based potential feeding schedules so that you can make the assessment for your own situation, for your own animal, and give it the best, healthiest life that you can when it comes to their food. We appreciate you coming along week after week after week. Our information will be in the description below. For those that need to get in touch with us, also feel free and write us in of other things you want us to film about. Don't forget about our other social media, TikTok, Reptile Rangers, Instagram, Kernersville Reptile Zoo, Facebook, Kernersville Reptile Zoo. And then, of course, you can come see us here at the zoo and store if you're needing anything. We do have the full storefront. Yes, we sell everything. Pets, supplies, food, housing. We appreciate you coming along week after week after week. We'll either see you here at the zoo or we'll see you on the next episode. Later.